I will be your moderator today. And I am joined by 4 great allies for women leadership, joined by Jeremy Farrar, who is the director of Wellcome Trust, Githinji Gitahi, who is the global CEO for Amref Health Africa. I'm also joined by Madhukar, who is the Canada Research Chair in Epidemiology and Global Health, and also the director at McGill International TB Center. And lastly, Ravi Verma, who is the Regional Director, International Center for Research on Women. This conversation is critical for us to have right now. A report by Nursing Now and InterHealth and Johnson & Johnson showed that 70% of women are actually in healthcare, but only 25% are in senior leadership. So we do not have a problem with women in healthcare, but instead we have a challenge of women in healthcare leadership. And to date, most leadership positions are dominated by white males, which is why it is important for us to be having a discussion with men on how to lean out and also how to make the best of male allyship. And the sad thing is, it is projected that it will take about 54 years to reach gender parity. And for many women, young or old, this is unacceptable. And for the men joining us on this panel, this is unacceptable because from their experience and from their work, they have been supporting women in leadership, pushing policy for gender equality, empowering women and girls in the health sector to become leaders. So great to have you all. And I'll start off with a question for all panelists to start us off. Why is women leadership in health important? And you may give an example that you see in your everyday work, if you wish. And to start us off, Ravi. Ravi, you're speaking, but you're on mute, so we can't hear you. Great.
Thank you very much for having me here. I think women leadership is critical. We see it almost on everyday basis. For example, in recent COVID-19 lockdown, when it began, we saw how the menstrual products were not really listed as one of as the essential items, list. Or we see, how sexual and reproductive health services often fail to deliver to the sensitivities of girls and women needing those services. And it is essentially because the ethos of the health system is not, infused with that sense of gender understanding of issues. And my sense is that women leadership is one critical need, and we hope that that kind of leadership would bring in the perspective that is needed across the institutions to recognize such needs and address them with that lens. But I think more important is to really gendering the process, to understand that these systems, institutions and organizations, health systems are, they look at the issue of women not only as women versus men, but as an attribution of gender that needs to be defining in delivering the services. And it's almost every time you are in the field, you are talking to people, you see that kind of need for that lens. So yes, I definitely think that women leadership would be an important message. It's symbolic, but it's critical that it provides that kind of perspective. Hopefully that really becomes the larger perspective.
Thanks, Ravi. And I couldn't agree more. Jeremy, why is it important to have women in leadership in healthcare?
Thanks very much, Tracy, and it's a pleasure to to be here and be amongst other friends as well here. And I think it's the only manual any of us will ever sit on, I hope. And we've all questioned whether we should. But in the end, it was the right thing to do. And I'm honoured to be joining other colleagues who we've known for many years. And I agree absolutely with what Ravi just said. And it'll get harder, I think, as we go along to come up with something that is different to what others have said. But I think it's even broader than Ravi suggests, actually. I think this is really about the sort of world we want to live in. Because this goes really, I think, to the heart of values that we all want to be in the sort of world we want for the future. And of course, yes, COVID has brought some of these issues to the fore, and the leadership that's been shown, whether it's from Moiti as head of WHO in the Africa region, or it's from New Zealand or Germany, Norway's role in, women leadership has been to the fore here. And I think that's brought home to many what some knew already, of course, that the perspective, the breadth, the diversity, the insights that people bring from whatever their background is, including, of course, gender, is just critical to perspective, decision making, and inclusive thinking. It is not a thing one does because one has to do it. You do it because you have to do it because of the values that you have, but you also do it because it's the right thing to do. It's the best thing to do, and it makes you better. So I think that's why it's so important, and it's, as Ravi said, but even broader. It's the sort of world we want to live in the 21st century.
Thanks, Jeremy. And we do want to live in a world where everyone, male or female, is working towards restoring gender equality. I read somewhere that COVID is the biggest setback to gender equality in the last 10 years. So the efforts that we put in now are not only for the future, but it's like trying to redeem the 10 years that we have lost during the pandemic. Githinji, why is it important for us to have women in leadership?
Thank you. And to take Jeremy's point, we are building on each other's points, actually. And this is the great thing about male allyship. We are building on each other. So I pick Ravi's point, I pick Jeremy's, and I build on that and say, actually, it is the right thing to do. And actually, the best time to do it was 100 years ago. And the next best time to do it is today, not tomorrow. So the one thing I've noticed actually through COVID is when you do not have women in leadership, it's then you have one population group actually making decisions for the entire population. And what I've seen is that you have major blind spots. Women wear a gender lens, which men miss when they're making decisions. And almost all the time, men have a certain level of gender blindness because they wear male privilege. We have in the last, several months, probably this year and towards the end of the year, talked a lot about privilege, whether you're talking about color privilege, you're talking about gender privilege, you're talking about whatever level of privilege. And when you wear privilege, it may not be deliberate, but you wear the privilege, and that privilege is what guides your decisions, And therefore, what I've seen, for example, in the COVID era, is a whole government will sit down and think about lockdown and entrench a curfew and say, from this time, no one is allowed to go out. And the people making that decision are men. If there are women in the room, one of them or several of them pregnant, they would say, hey, how do we go to the hospital if we are in labor after curfew? Is that provided for in this policy? But because it's men making decisions, you say curfew, no one is allowed to travel after 7 p.m. and that becomes law. And then you have women clobbered by police because they're trying to go to the hospital because they are in labor. The decisions are gender blind because we don't have women in leadership on that table. So I would say that there is actually no way out, there's no option. If we are not thinking and bringing women into leadership, then you're practicing discrimination.
Absolutely agree, Githinji. Madhu.
Thanks, everyone. I think it's good to kind of look at some data here. Every single aspect of global health, whether it's leadership roles, CEO, board chairs, funding, research publications, giving talks, sitting on panels, is dominated by two groups of people. One is men, second is people in high income countries. Every single aspect. So if we believe as equity as a centerpiece of global health, and we have such a power dynamic in global health, these two statements are not compatible. So the gorilla in the room for me are the fact that every aspect of global health is dominated by men and people in high income countries. And so how do we then ask, say, people, women and those in low and middle income countries should lean in? How do they lean in if we have taken over the entire damn real estate? There is no space for them to lean in. So if men don't lean out, and if people in high income countries don't lean out of global health, we will never have equity in global health. There's no point in just saying lean in, lean in, lean in, when there is no space to lean in. So that's why leaning out is critical for both groups, for men, as well as people in high income countries.
Thank you, Madi. And to your point of the highest number of leadership positions being occupied by white men or men in high income countries, I'd like to hear from Jeremy. How do you think that we can create change? How do you think we can get more women in leadership positions and also bring more men to support the cause of gender equality? Yet, as Madhu said, there is no space because it's full. How can we create that space? And this is the community that we need to activate. Clearly.
Yeah, I think Manu's point there about space is a really important one, and I think he's absolutely right in that. But in order to create space, you can't just be in favor of something. I think you've got to be go further than that and actually be anti something, because in the main, I think just being in favor is not really enough. I suspect most people, many people, all people would be in favor, but I think you've got to be more active than that, and you've got to be anti something in order to bring about change. You've got to be anti-racist. It's not good enough to sit on the fence. It's not good enough to just not espouse racist ideas or gender inequalities. You've got to be anti it, because I think that sense of urgency and that sense of pressure is really important. Your comment, Tracy, earlier of the 54 years, the truth is when something is 54 years away, it just gets forgotten. It's almost irrelevant to you today. I think it's about having an urgency, and Madhu's point about space is important. I think it also means being focused and having data, and being held accountable for changing that data, because otherwise it's a bit, in my view, a bit too fluffy. And I think all of us in any positions can just sort of hide behind, things like this is a long-term problem and it'll take many years to resolve and the rest of it. And, there has to be the urgency of impatience to change this. And you can only do that when I think you have data and you're held accountable and you hold yourself to accountable for bringing about change. And then it isn't just about espousing the right things, but it's also about putting in place concrete things that make a difference to that. The first thing, sorry, just one more minute, it just is, although it may seem personal, here I am, a male and white and the rest of it. But if it's not us that help bring about this through allyship, authentic allyship, rather than transactional allyship, then I'm not sure who else can. And therefore, whilst it is personal, it can't be personalized to feel embittered about it. The opportunity is to change it. And actually that does involve occasionally, often, being uncomfortable or discomforted by it. But frankly, you have to work through that. Because if you can work through it, and I'm not suggesting for a second I've worked through it completely yet, But when you can start to work through it, then not only do you come to be comfortable with it, you actually come to enjoy it as well, because you feel you're part of progress. And I think that's very positive for all of us.
Thanks, Jeremy. Being an ally, it means giving up power. Leaning out means giving up power that has been in the hands of the males for a long, long time. And so there may be people that are attending this conference that are men that are wondering, how can they be part of the solution? How can they lean out? How can they be allies to bring more women into the health leadership space? And Githinji, if you would start us off with some ideas on how that can be practiced by other men who may be attending this conference as well. Githinji, I think you're on mute though.
These are the famous words of 2020. You're on mute. Anyway, so here I am. And, you know, I would like to say I really appreciate what Jeremy is saying around the fact that if you're a silent supporter of gender equality, you are an enabler of gender inequality. So you have to take a stand that you cannot watch from the fringes. If you want change, then you have to really make change. And I know there is a question that you know, I was going to answer, so I could just bring on some of my points earlier now, Tracy, if you allow me.
Yeah, of course.
That actually, we know, especially because, you know, I've been brought up in Africa. Not many of you know I was brought up in a family of 9 members. I have 9 siblings. Or 8 siblings, and out of those 5 are women. So I've been brought up in an environment where women were part of the family. We grew up with them. But when I look back, I see probably out of the family, it's only 2 men who actually went to college out of 4 men. So that's 50%. And 0% of the women went to college. I am number 8. And you can see that was kind of, you know, it was socially and culturally acceptable that that could happen. And this is why I said that the best time to have this conversation could have been 100 years ago. The next best time is today that we are having it now. Now, the first thing that men need to do across here, the allies of gender equality and female leadership, is first accept that women discrimination exists. I think that is a challenge that we've had of ensuring that men, even those who are here with us, you know, in the audience and the ones we work with, we often don't accept that it exists, and you hear arguments around, no, everyone has an equal playing field. You know, what are we discussing here? You will know probably, and you don't, that Kenya has a constitutional issue around ensuring that Parliament has a certain gender balance, that no single sex or gender can actually take more than 2/3 majority. Up to now, from 2012, we've never achieved it. And the Constitutional Court ruled that Parliament should be dissolved for failure to achieve this gender equality that is required by the Constitution. But every time Parliament meets to pass the necessary changes that would allow this to be achieved, men don't show up to Parliament because they probably are just verbal supporters of this rule, but they're not active supporters, as Jeremy was saying. So we must accept that the discrimination exists and that we want to resolve it. The second thing is we must consciously stop being a barrier to ending the discrimination and ensuring that we stop being a barrier to opening that space. That means the conscious decision that I am going to not to be a barrier. The third thing is that we must actively then identify the barriers that exist and then work to overcome them. And many of them are legal, constitutional, institutional, cultural, social. We know that probably only, I think I was reading something that about 180 countries in the world have some form of legislation that actually discriminates against women leadership, women growth, economic emancipation. 170 countries across the world. And only 61 countries or so actually have a constitutional mention of equal pay for equal work. So these are barriers that it doesn't mean that we can spend all our time fixing women. We don't need to fix women. Women don't need to be fixed. The issue is we need to fix the barrier. So for us as allies, we need to work together with women to fix the barriers actively. And as you said, Tracy, leaning out means giving up power. So we have to give up the power. Once we realize the region exists, we have to give up power. And I think that is one of the most difficult conversations of giving up power. And that's what we have to do. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Githinji. And I would like to follow that up with a question for Ravi. You have done incredible work in the women and girl empowerment field, in shaping policy that ensures gender equality and serving on various committees that are backing this cause. Could you please share with us, in continuation with what Githinji just presented, could you please share with us some examples of the concrete action you have taken to see that you tangibly demonstrate what it means to be an ally?
Well, thank you, Githanji, for making those points. I was trying to reflect on the barriers that Githinji is talking, and my experience in this, in this journey has been that a lot of what we do and say while engaging men and boys is about taking them to a more introspective, more critical thinking process. It is, it is eventually letting them know or telling them that it's not a zero-sum game that we are kind of engaged in. Once, it's not, somebody's victory is not your loss, or your victory is not at the loss of someone else. And this is easily said than done. And why do we, how do we do it? I think we do it essentially by moving away from a binary discussion of man versus women. We should not see gender as an attribute of a person. It is a process of institutionalizing gender relations, actually. And the moment you take that lens in our conversations, in our actions, the discourse changes, because then men begin to see their own disadvantages, that comes along with the entitlements that they get. So it is men versus men, and men versus women, and women versus women. It is not a homogeneous category of women versus a monolithic category of men that we are talking. Masculinities have, all of us know, have been discussed and have been deconstructed for many years, and has been translated into programs to see that there are men and men and men, that. And I think to bring in this entire perspective of how I see myself in relation to another man, and why do I in one context feel very powerful and another context I'm powerless, and how do I negotiate those spaces, is something that if we begin to appreciate that, then the women become part of that equation of that conversation. We begin to see that gender is kind of a contested space. We are constantly within the realm of masculinity. We have always seen that one of the attributes that men have always been have sort of seen with is proving themselves all the time. And I think that even if they're ally, they should not be seen as proving. They're not speaking for women. They're speaking with them. And why with them? Because it is because they themselves have gone through that process of disadvantages. So it's not. I don't think it's about giving up your entitlement of privileges, because those entitlement and privileges continue to shift and change in different contexts. And I think ability to see how relatively we are positioned, and how we constantly edge someone else and get that space is important for men to realize more, because in patriarchal kind of framework, men seem to imbibe these much more easily, those practices of power games, if I say, right from, and that socialization that happens right from very beginning, men and boys, they are brought into this kind of thinking. And if one has to really change, the concrete example you asked me, in many programs in our offices also we do it. I see on a very simple decision making process that happens, it goes through a gender lens. To give an example, we were just discussing about when to open our office during this COVID time. I'm taking 2 minutes. And that was not a simple decision that, okay, on 17th September, we would just open and people would start coming. And we said it will be on a voluntary basis. It will be done at will. And there will be complete work from home policy in place. There is no, there is literally no compulsion for anyone to come who feels like coming, because there were many women colleagues who wanted to get out of the homes and wanted an alternative space to work. And given all the safety protocols and guidelines and system in place, we began to wonder and design our protocols to have everyone in alternative ways of working in the offices. But even this whole idea of flexibility was questioned by my colleagues, everyone. Does flexibility mean that it will not kind of bring in with it a sense of hierarchy, where if the seniors come, juniors would definitely be expected to come? And where is the voice for that? How do you define? We had a whole workshop among ourselves to deconstruct the idea of flexibility and the implicit power dynamics that might play in who comes and how brownie points are taken, how one loses a point during appraisal time. If you don't show yourself brave, then that you didn't come. And more, will it be true that more men colleagues would come to the office and women colleagues will not come? Will that go against them? So I think having that kind of a critical lens and giving everyone in the down the line in the whole spectrum of our office spaces and families, we need to make sure that they should have the courage, they should have the ability to question, and without being threatened by asking those questions. So I'm saying that in concrete sense, we give these abilities to ourselves first of all, that we can question and not feel threatened about questioning the power dynamics, and make sure that everyone engages in those conversations. And then we move away from this kind of categorical discussions to a more fluid and negotiated discussions, where men can, and there I've seen that men and boys, or men especially and working, they get engaged because they also want to be heard. They also want to feel equal and respected, and they also and from that standpoint, they also want to respect and feel respected by others. So I think this is a kind of a dynamic, ongoing, continuous process that we need to engage in, and it's the personal journey, and everybody who engages in as an ally has to take a personal journey into oneself to see where is my bottleneck. I see my body language. I constantly look at my own language. I see whom I giving cues and whom I'm not giving cues to talk and not to talk. There are a whole lot of things that we do on day-to-day basis, which is extremely gendered, and we do it, without even noticing them. So I think it's a reflection onto oneself as a man primarily, and giving that space to feel that, okay, there's nothing wrong in this, do this, and therefore then you begin to cultivate bystander kind of interventions in these places. So men and women both begin to raise voices. Look, this is not right. So I'll just stop here, but I think I can go on this. There have been, on a day-to-day basis, there is a lot of examples that we constantly deal with this. We have to keep gender as kind of central theme of power analysis and relational relational aspects of our ideas that need to be constantly define our work. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ravi. I'm sure you could go on for another 12 hours, but great points so far that you've raised in those few minutes. What I picked up is you are training, you start them young. You're also teaching boys about gender equality and um, encouraging everyone else to have a gender lens and not to be gender blind. And also to have the gender sensitivity and look at everything through a gender lens, because everything is affected by gender in the world that we live in. And I like what you said about everyone being in the conversation, because most people that are passionate about women in leadership, sometimes even I myself as an advocate, I am tempted to throw men out. But the truth is that we need you, we need the allies, we need the men, we need everyone in the conversation, men, women, youth. We need everyone in a conversation about gender equality, because it affects everyone. I saw McKinsey did a research that showed that if only we could reach gender parity, if we reached it now, and we had equal opportunities for women to have same access to jobs, the economy would be boosted, the GDP would be boosted. We would have 26 trillion US dollars that is added. So it does affect everything. And as to what you said, everyone needs to be in the conversation. I'd just like to hear from Madhu about how we can get more men on board with leaning out. You've spoken on various forums about the importance of leaning out.
Thank you, Tracy. So it might help to have more concrete examples. So I can only talk about what I've done myself. And again, I don't think I did any of this, say, 10 years ago. It has taken me a long time to wake up and to reach this level of understanding. And I'm not saying I have it right, but I have taken plenty of baby steps. So everything I'm going to tell you is something I've actually done myself already. And I will tell you how well they're working or not. Firstly, having reached the position of being a full professor now, I get dozens of invitations to give talks. And earlier I may have said, I'm sorry, I'm too busy. I don't say that anymore. I instead say I'm busy, but I'm going to suggest a few women of color in the global South who really understand this topic as well or better than I do. Please invite them. And it is important for this, that, and the other reason. And guess what? The organizers love it. They've gone ahead and invited them, and they've gotten back to me saying, thank you for suggesting this person. She was outstanding. So to me, that's such a low-hanging fruit. I can deflect a lot of those invitations to the right set of people. I have stepped down from editorial boards, and I've written to the editor-in-chief saying, please replace me with women of color from the global South. One of them, I don't know what they did. They replaced me with someone, but they never told me. But in another case, this was a Lancet family journal, the editor loved the idea. She got back to me saying that we've replaced you with 2 women of color from Africa and Asia. I mean, that is incredible. And I think that is, again, it didn't cost me much. I'm on so many editorial boards, one more, one less doesn't make an iota of difference in my career. Thirdly, when I write op-eds, and I write a lot for Forbes and other pieces, and I invite quotes from a lot of people, when I finish, before I hit the publish button on my op-ed, I actually sit and count with a pen and a paper. How many experts have I quoted? How many men, how many women, and how many people from low and middle income countries? I try very hard to bring that balance, and it has made a huge difference to the quality of my op-eds. They are no longer just my ideas, they reflect the diversity of opinions. But this I learned did not come naturally to me. I had to actually thoughtfully, deliberately sit and make it a habit. Otherwise, I'll end up quoting mostly men and mostly men around me in North America. That's how my brain normally works. I've helped mentor women with job searches, writing letters of reference, but these days I go one step further. I say, if you are shortlisted for the job or if you're offered a job, you get back to me and you show me your job offer letter, because I'm going to help you negotiate a much stronger package. Because women don't do that. They accept the first job offer that is given to them, and they also don't know how to ask what to ask. So I tell them, here is my job offer letter that I got at my university. Take a look at every single item. Make sure you ask for money. Make sure you ask for space. You ask for administrative support, startup package. It's a whole checklist. And do not accept the first offer. Go back again and again and again until you reach the right level, because a first offer is always a low ball offer, right? And that, I think, these women that I've mentored have valued a lot. I've organized all female panels. In fact, 2 of them. They were outstanding in terms of their quality. And it took me a long time to reach this level. And I would not have done that 5-10 years ago. And lastly, when I teach courses or I sit on commissions and panels, right on the first day of the committee meeting, I point out a lack of gender balance or lack of representation from low and middle income countries. And I tell them this is not acceptable to me. Again, I did not do this 10 years ago. I just didn't feel empowered enough to call them out. But I don't care now whether it's a Lancet commission or a WHO panel. I'm very comfortable in raising my voice right at the start so that they can go fix the imbalance in these panels. So these are a few examples of stuff that I'm actually doing. I'm not saying this is for everyone, but I'm saying when you are really established in your career, these things honestly don't cost anything. My CV will not diminish. I'm already well past that stage in my life. Giving up power and privilege is much easier than earning power and privilege. So giving up is much easier. And I think established men can do way more than what they're doing right now. Why are they accumulating more and more power when they already have their wall full of awards and medals and 500 publications and $8 million in grants? I just can't understand why they cannot do more than what they're currently doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhu. Neither can I. Just real quick, what happened between now and you say 10 years ago you would not do that? So what triggered you to start acting the way you started?
Again, when we are younger, we are keen to get tenured and promoted. We want to make a mark in life. We want to earn money. I think I understand all of that. I think it has also come out a lot of the research that I myself have done. For example, my own team did a research on diversity of editorial boards. And guess what? Editorial boards of global health journals are dominated by men from high income countries. When I publish a paper saying that there's a problem, how can I not then act upon the results, right? So I know the least represented person on editorial boards is a woman of color from the global south. That's why I've stepped away from editorial boards and offered that spot, because I myself have published that it's a problem. So I need to act on what I'm learning, right? So I'm giving talks on decolonizing global health, but if I then don't walk the talk, then I can't possibly fix this problem. It's just going to continue forever and ever.
Absolutely. Thanks, Madhu. We have heard a bit from you and Ravi about what you're doing in your organizations to lean out. And now I'll hand it over to Jeremy to tell us about what he's doing as a director of Wellcome Trust with his team to ensure that your organization is leaning out. And then Githinji will follow with that examples from Amref. Over to you,
thanks.
Jeremy.
And I think the examples that Madhu puts forward there are really important because what he describes there with his typical sort of generosity is things that everyone can do. And often I think it's true for all of us that we don't really know where to start. And I think sort of taking, if you like, the fear out of this, I think is very important. This isn't a loss. It's not a sense of loss to you. It's a sense of gain. And I think sometimes it's much easier to sort of put this in the sense of what does one gain by the actions that Madhu's just described or Ravi was talking about, rather than a sense, what will you lose if you do this? Because actually, everybody on this panel, I'm sure, would agree, and you actually have far more to gain than you have to lose. And I think reframing it like that, but you do also have to educate yourself, and we all have to educate ourselves. Madhu says it was a 10 years ago, he wouldn't have thought like that. He will like to be very different 10 years from now. And he's going to have to continue educating himself, as we all are, but that is not something to be fearful of, even if it is discomforting to all of us at some point. But if it is discomforting, it's another reason for leaning out into it rather than trying to pretend it's not there, and perhaps have a degree of humility, but also confidence that you're not going to lose, you'll gain. Yeah, at Wellcome, we are nowhere near where we would like to be. I just say that at the start. I do think in terms of global health issues, this concept of shifting the center of gravity is critical. Shifting decision making, shifting where questions are asked and what questions are asked and how they're asked needs to shift, as everybody has said, from Toronto or Washington or London or Paris or Geneva to where the issues are. And that in itself will have, I think, a huge impact. You've got to have data. You've got to know, as a funding body like Wellcome, we've got to know if you're male, if you're white, if you're non-white, if you're female, if you whatever you are, what's your chances of getting a grant? And if there's a difference there, that's got to be addressed. So, white applicants at Wellcome, I know, have a success rate of about 16%. BAME applicants have a success rate of about 11%. That is a big difference. Men it's 14.8%, and women it's 13.6%. It doesn't sound much, but that's very significant, and it is due to the inherent biases that the system there. So one of the things for us is been to actually admit the problem. Secondly, to have data on which to show that you're making a difference and changing, not just thinking you are. And then holding yourself to account, not for short-term fixes, they won't solve any problem, but making sure that you're on a trend which has the urgency of the moment, not 54 years away that you said, Tracy, at the start of all of this, but that you will get there quicker than that. And then as somebody that's in a position for a certain period of time, like I am, saying what you will achieve before you leave. And being very explicit about that and be willing to be held accountable. And I think that is the sort of things that you can do. The most positive thing I think on this that I've done actually is reverse mentoring with colleagues at Wellcome. And that, opened eyes to things that certainly I would not have considered even, say, 2 or 3 years ago, let alone Madhu's decade ago. And I think reverse mentoring for me was one of the most useful things I did, I must say.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's good to recognize where we are and where we want to go. So it's really great that you're not where you want to be, but you're working towards that. Githinji, you lead the Amref team as the global CEO in Africa. And you have said often that gender equality is a critical component for achieving universal health coverage and reaching other, if not most, of the health goals. How do you ensure that your teams place gender at the center of your work at Amref?
Well, thank you. And let me first start by sharing my own experience. I think there's a question you asked Madhu about when did it start? And I think Jeremy has also reflected on this. The one thing I can tell you, and I want to be very honest about this conversation, that the conversation we are having does not come naturally to men. It does not. And I think it is so critically important that we start to focus, even as we focus on women, the bigger conversation is to focus on the context and the environment. Because there is a common saying, I think it's my wife who told me this, and in her communication class, they were told, the dominant culture always wins. Now, the dominant culture in an African context is paternalistic. It will always win. When I was born, I would not have had this conversation. And in fact, I was reflecting on this as Madhu was speaking, that for me, it would not have occurred to me that actually, because I was brought up being told, these are the roles for men, these are the roles for women. And I'll give you incidences. We had time over a glass of wine where, according to my mother, as a boy, I was supposed to be the one to milk the cow. But milking a cow required that you have warm water. But I would not be the one to warm the water because that's the job of my sister. And that's how I grew up. It wasn't that it was a hostile environment. It was a really loving rural family, but those were the norms. So the conversation around different roles of gender, discrimination, leadership, were never something that I had to sit down and think about. It was almost, unnatural. It was a norm that this is the way it's supposed to be, that when men gathered in the village, when my father gathered with his age mates, my mother and her colleagues were not allowed to sit in there. When we had a marriage happening or a community activity, it would be the men to sit and the women would be in the kitchen. And it wasn't because there was a law around it. It was just norms. So when did I change? Because of course, almost all my life, that was it. I then went to, when I went to high school, I didn't go to a co-education school. I went to a boys' school and the girls went to a girls' school. So the culturation process is long and we have to break it. The person who made me change and start to see this issue of gender equality as something that I was actually now trying to resolve on borrowed time because I'd wasted so much time for my family, for my friends, for my community, was my daughter, who is now turning 24. Because somewhere around when she was around 18, 16, she became a feminist. And I could see real life reasons why she's a feminist and why it was so critical for women to be at the table, for us to achieve social justice, for us to basically be human and be human beings. And as I progressed in the area of public health, I saw that if we do not actually tackle the issue that my daughter taught me about, then we are not going to achieve this. And for me now as Amref, I can say that in my group leadership team, which is a global group leadership team, I have 7 members, 67% of them are women. In a team of 7, we are 7 of us, 67 of them, 67% in that team are women. And I can tell you, I do not regret that decision. When I go down to the senior leadership team, 60% are women. My only regret so far is that I have not managed to move my international board from 40% women to fair share of about 50% or 50% and above of women, which is what I'm working on deliberately, which is what I talked about, identifying what barriers are there and actively overcoming those barriers. So for me, I think the most important thing here is going back to the statement around the dominant culture always wins. What we are doing at Amref and what we have done to achieve at least what levels we've achieved at management is that we must deliberately uproot the patriarchal culture. How do you uproot the patriarchal culture? It calls upon reviewing all policies and actually editing them and formatting them to be gender responsive. So you have to actively do that. The second thing that we've done is actually changing people. And when you realize that you have people in leadership who've been in the organization for many years and they hold a patriarchal view, these people are the people you rely upon to hire. They're the people you rely upon to watch over your safeguarding policy. They're the people you rely upon to interview and to make a decision that is gender responsive. If they truly are patriarchal in their thinking and they can't change, you have to approach them. You have to actually make change in the organization for it to be gender responsive. These are the things we are doing. And I believe truly that we are making progress.
Thank you, Githinji. Our time is fast spent and we have about 8 minutes left. We have 4 questions from the audience and I think some of them have been answered. What are you doing personally and within your organizations to lean out? I believe you have answered that. The question that has appeared twice and that I would like us to take 1 minute strictly to answer is, how do women convince men to lean out when most men don't even recognize or understand the concept of male privilege? And another person asked a similar question, how should women start the conversation with men who don't realize that they are perpetuating gender norms and stereotypes? How do we start that? I know there's many ladies and many women watching that want to break the status quo, to shift the status quo. So how do we start? Where do we start? I'll just leave that open. Madhu.
I'm in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm also learning a lot. For example, if white people invented race and racism to privilege themselves, then they must be involved in dismantling racism, right? I think the same is true for men. Men need to understand that they're a big part of the problem and must be involved in dismantling it. But then when you have these conferences on women or gender, it's mostly women in the room. You're missing men who really need to hear those messages and to role model for other men, because men are more likely to listen to men from that perspective, right? It's like white people are more likely to listen to white role models who are willing to dismantle racism. So that's why when I look at the agenda here, I find that 8% of the conference is male speakers. And I understand why that is, but I would argue that women who organize global health events must try and find a way to bring men into the conversation so that men can wake up and then have role models who concretely give examples that other men will understand. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to make progress, because we're talking, I mean, women already know what the problem is. They've known it for centuries and nothing has changed. Men need to wake up. They need to be brought into the fold, I think.
Githinji.
I would like to contribute to add to what Madhukar said, which is very important, because you said earlier, Tracy, that we have 54 years to achieve gender equity or gender parity. We don't have 54 years to wait. I mean, I'm 50. I don't think I'll be alive by 104, and I want to leave.
Githinji, I am 31. At 54, I will be 80 something. So I really can't wait, and many of my friends can't wait either.
Exactly. We have to be impatient allies, because I can't, I want to see it one day and say, remember that panel we had? How unthinkable. We can't even have a panel like that anymore, because it's no longer an issue for discussion. And I think the one thing that the person who has that question, is very critical, that we realize that this generation that we are in that's discussing this, it's possible to change, but it's a really hard nut to crack, because these are set views. I've talked about paternalistic views, culture, norms. So as we discuss here as allies, we need to step back and ask about who is going to be in this panel 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. We need to go back and change the mindset today before they get to this panel. And I think that women need to work with organizations, with governments, to start changing the school curriculum of primary school kids, elementary, secondary, so that when they get where we are, this conversation is unthinkable, because it will have been discussed as a norm in culture. And that needs to start where the norms are worst right now, that's in Africa, as we move across. But that's something that I think would answer that question that has been asked. Thank you.
Thanks, Githinji. Another question that we have is, how do men allies portray their support, their behavior traits or skills, skill sets that you display regularly? I do believe we have answered that question. I just want, in the last 3 minutes, I just want to go back to something that I started out with saying that the highest, the top positions are taken over by men, and these men are white in high income countries, and most times they do not realize the kind of privilege that we've been talking about that they have. A study was conducted where only 37% of the women said they feel like gender has been a being female has been a disadvantage in progressing leadership, and only 8% say that that was an issue, and this was in America. I want to throw this back to Jeremy. How do we engage the white men from high income countries? Someone mentioned, I think it was Madhu or Ravi, who said men only listen to men. So if we could, I'm glad you're here, Jeremy, because a man would definitely listen to you. But how do we get more people like you, Jeremy, to be allies and to talk and to fight for gender equality and to push for women in leadership, in global health leadership? Over to you, Jeremy. Yeah. And I know we have 2 minutes, so I'll give you half a minute.
And thank you for your moderating of the session. And please don't hold me up as being some person with all the answers here, because if Madhu's been on this for a decade, I'm newer to this, which is why I was taking such copious notes. I think in general, I think human behavior, you have to give people both a bit of a stick and a carrot. I think we have to incentivize behavior, and we have to frame it more as a gain than a loss for all of us, not just when we become senior, as Madhu was saying, but also throughout our time, so that this isn't a fear, but it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity, as Githinji said, to be on the right side of history as well, because we all know where this is going. And I think stressing the positives for everybody in this, rather than stressing the losses, I think is critical, and the opportunities that can come from it. And the other is to know that in behavior change, I think as well, there'll be early adopters. There'll be people that are sitting and waiting and seeing, where can I follow or whatever. And then there will be people that you'll really struggle to ever convince. And I think having different ways of working with each of those sorts of groups, I think is really important to do so. And and it's been a privilege to be with everybody else on this call. And I hope we get a chance to do it again, even if it's not a manual next time.
In the last 1 minute, Ravi, I want to hear your thoughts on how we can engage this group.
Well, I think I said that before, and that my sense is that assuming that all women are at the receiving end is, again, one has to watch out. There are women who are empowered and women who are at the negotiation tables, and they are in a position to bring these conversations up front. And I think at any point in time, we should really refrain from imagining or assuming that men are the givers and they are the ones who have to give up, who have to do it, and women have to receive it. I think as I said, it's a space that is constantly being contested, and that's where the empowered women who are already on the scene and who are there, they have a lot of responsibility, in my view, in terms of keeping these conversations on. Men have to be brought into conversation from a perspective of making them to think internally, to introspect more. I think this whole idea of men, again, sort of thinking of them as a monolithic category, we have to move away from that. And we need to bring in, and we have seen, there are lots of programs that we do, we have seen that men also want to have a safe space to talk about their own disprivileges or their losses. I think, and then there are ways to bring them. So I think if we are focused on this whole issue of making gender as a process to dismantle the power relations, then it's easy to bring in that conversation between women, between men and women. So there are many different ways of intervening and bringing these conversations, which could become uncomfortable at one point, but people find their ways to extend their boundaries. And that's why I said, when I sit here on this panel, I also feel a little embarrassed.
When you have to cut to cut
last 10 seconds, I think I see it as a process. So when I sit here and talk, I don't think I've arrived. I also think that I'm learning and everyone else is evolving this process. I think that should be the perspective for men to converse and for everyone to converse.
Absolutely agree. Thank you, Ravi. None of us has arrived. It is a work in progress, and we can always do better, and recognize where we are and aim for better and to be better allies. Thank you so much, Githinji, Madhu, Ravi, Jeremy, for taking the time and also accepting to be on a manual, because I know from your experience and your values and beliefs that you do not like manuals, but I know you understand that this was for a great cause. I was honored to be a moderator, and I would like to close the session. For the conference participants, do please click on your main stage tab at the top of your browser to go back to the plenary panel. The plenary will begin after a 5-minute break. I would like to have this conversation again. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
It's a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.